r/Nosleep. Posted by TPSavage. I keep finding human teeth in my apartment. The first one was in my cereal. I was sprawled on the couch, absent-mindedly chewing a mouthful of stale Frosted Flakes when I suddenly bit down on something hard. My stomach lurched. Was it a rock? A piece of plastic? I spat it out and looked at it. There, glistening in my hand, was a small white tooth. A wave of nausea sent me dashing to my toilet. After a few painful minutes of dry heaving, I was in the kitchen, sifting through the box of cereal looking to see if there were any other disgusting surprises waiting inside for me. I didn't find any, but that didn't stop me from throwing the box in the garbage. I considered calling the company's number and screaming at a customer service rep, but honestly couldn't be bothered. I ended up resuming my morning routine and vowing never to eat a Kellogg's product again. However, that was far from the end of it. Over the next week, I began finding more and more teeth. A molar nestled in the back of my medicine cabinet, a chipped, white incisor under my bed. My mind reeled at the insanity of it all. It was a relatively new apartment. Had they been there from the very start? No, that didn't explain the one in the cereal. Despite my numerous attempts to rationalize the situation, I eventually had to admit what was happening. Someone was putting them in my apartment. The thought caused an electric burst of dread in my chest. Not just from my current, disturbing situation, but because of my past. You see, almost 9 years ago to the day, my family was devastated by the loss of my sister, Julie. After a long, arduous investigation that turned up no body, no weapon, and no suspects, the police eventually concluded that she'd simply gotten lost in the woods. Despite that, my young mind remained convinced that some boogeyman had taken her. I spent the rest of my childhood terrified of the day the man who took her came back to finish the job. Eventually, with the help of a little counseling, and more than a little booze, I put it all behind me. But with each new tooth I found, I felt that fear returning, settling back in its place like an old friend. Needless to say, I immediately called the police. They collected the teeth for testing, about 6 or 7, and strongly suggested I get the locks changed. I immediately called my landlord to have him do just that, but was greeted by his wife instead. Hey, I said awkwardly. I'm Alex, one of Donnie's tenants. Is he there? Her voice was harried and tired. I can answer any of your questions. I've been handling everything while he recovers. Recovers? What happened to him? Well, she said, dragging out the word. There was an incident last week. He was mugged on his way to his car. I brought a hand to my mouth. Jesus. He'll be okay, right? He's got a mild concussion, but he should be fine. I felt a burning in my chest and realized I'd been holding my breath. I let it out but still felt a sense of unease. Donnie had been attacked last week. Exactly when I'd found the first tooth. I had an awful thought and asked her a question on a hunch. Can you indulge me, for a second? Was a master key one of the things that were stolen? No, of course, N. She paused. When she spoke again it was with less conviction. I don't believe so. If you don't mind. Can you please double-check with him? She obliged and came back a few minutes later, relaying Donnie's message. He says yes, he may have had a copy of the master key at the time. Why, did you have a break-in? I told her the situation and she agreed to send someone over to change the locks as soon as possible. By the end of the day, I had a shiny, new keypad on my door. It did wonders for my state of mind, but the whole ordeal still left a black cloud of dread that persisted over the next few days. Had someone stolen a master key just to break into my apartment? The thought made my skin erupt into goosebumps. In an effort to shake off the constant anxiety, I ordered a few motion detectors online. When they finally arrived, I remember thinking the box felt lighter than it should have been. Unfortunately, I didn't think anything of it and opened it up. Nothing could have prepared me for what I found inside. 2 severed ears sat in the box, browned from decomposition. My stomach shifted violently and I dropped the box in disgust. I sunk to the floor and stared at it, trying, and failing, to decipher why on earth this was happening to me. The cops were there in minutes, snapping pictures and asking a barrage of seemingly never-ending questions. I was eventually pulled aside by the lead detective, a dark-haired man in a tweed jacket. He had an absurdly gravelly voice that sounded the way sandpaper feels. We're going to need to search the apartment for any sign of who's been harassing you. Are there any relatives you can stay with for the night? Yeah, I said shakily. My parents live down by the city. I can stay with them. He frowned. Is there anyone a little closer? In case we need to ask you some questions? I hesitated. Well, I guess my sister's just a half hour away. I'll give her a call. I was hoping could get through this without having to contact Luca, but it seemed I didn't have a choice. The end of my relationship with my big sister hadn't been loud or flashy. There was no massive argument that drove us apart forever. There was just the quiet unspoken agreement that we didn't need to be in each other's lives. Despite all this, I eventually found myself on Luca's front porch, overnight bag in hand. I winced when she opened the door. Luca and Julie had been twins, you see, and even after 9 years, I couldn't look at my sister without being taken back to that day. When she saw me, she looked puzzled, before quickly replacing it with a sort of strained excitement. "Oh my God, Xander. What a..." She trailed off, wringing her hands together. "How have you been?" "I've been better actually," I said dryly. "I tried calling but..." "Yeah, I got a new phone." The silence hung heavy between us. I felt like I should have been offended that she hadn't bothered to tell me this, but I honestly didn't. "Listen, I'm sorry for just showing up, but something's happened. My apartment's been broken into." I left out the more colorful details of the story, not wanting to freak her out. Now, looking back, maybe she should have been. "Oh my God, were you hurt?" "No, it happened while I was gone. Either that or while I was sleeping," I thought to myself. "I know it's short notice, but do you think, if it's not too much trouble?" She smiled and rolled her eyes. "Yes, Xander, you can stay." I smiled and followed Luca inside. She set me up in her guest room, telling me I could stay as long as I needed. After I was settled, she plopped down on the bed next to me with 2 Bud Lights, holding one out to me like a peace offering. "For the nerves," she said. I happily accepted. 1 drink turned to 2, and 2 turned to 3, and eventually, we were both pleasantly buzzed and talking with an ease that I never thought would have been possible. We laughed, and joked, and just generally caught each other up on what had happened after we'd last spoken, about 4 years ago by my count. However, the conversation eventually ended up where it always did. "Julie. God, you're just like her," I said. "Well duh," she said, grinning. "We're twins." "It's not just that, it's everything. The way you talk, the way you carry yourself." I smiled and nodded at her dice earrings, flashy and red. "Even your weirdo fashion sense." She punched me playfully and gazed out the window. "Yeah, I see her every time I look in the mirror." She sniffed. The month she went missing, I'd wash my hands with my eyes closed just so I didn't have to see myself in the bathroom mirror. How stupid is that? I realized her eyes were shiny with tears and I laced our fingers together. "Not at all," I said. "Everyone said it'd get better but, it never did. It's been nearly a decade and I still just want her back." She took in a shaky breath and I slowly realized it was from fear, not grief. "And the worst part is, I think he's back." I snapped to attention. The mysterious he she was referring to needed no explanation. Our parents dismissed it as nonsense, but my sister and I had never quite let go of the suspicion that Julie's disappearance had been more than an accident. "Why? What happened?" She kneaded one hand in the other nervously. "About a week ago, I went on a spa day with a friend from work. After we'd gone our separate ways, I caught the bus back home. A few stops before mine, this guy gets on stained dress shirt, scraggly hair. I smelled the BO on him from 5 feet away. There are no empty seats, so he asks in a mumble to sit with me. I start making up an excuse, but he just plops down next to me anyway. Everything's fine for a few minutes, but he starts rambling to himself. I was about to put my headphones in when I hear my name, like my full name. I'm afraid asking the driver to stop the bus might make the guy more agitated, so I decide to just wait for the next stop. Meanwhile, the guy's going on and on about how it's not his fault and how he didn't mean to do it to her. When the bus finally stops, I quickly get up and start scooting past him. I'm almost out when he grabs my arm. I pull and pull, but his arm is like a vice. Luca rubbed her arm absent-mindedly, eyes glassy, brow furrowed. He looks at me with big bloodshot eyes and says, "Don't worry, I'll make this right." Then he finally lets me go and I stumble off the bus. I still remember the way he stared at me as it drove away. The tears were back in her eyes now. "I can't stop worrying about it," she said. "I can't get it out of my head." I opened my mouth to speak, but there was nothing to say. The boogeyman who'd haunted our childhood was finally back, ready to finish the job he'd started 9 years ago. In the end, I just hugged her, and she hugged me back. It was the last normal moment we'd spent together before she flipped my world upside down. What if he breaks in? What if he carves me up the way he did her? Did you catch that? It took a moment, but when I did, I broke into a cold sweat. Carved up? Was Julie carved up? Her eyes flashed like she'd suddenly realized something. Yeah, I mean maybe. I hope not. Her body was never found. How do you know she was carved up? She blinked. I just assumed it, she said, a little too quickly. How else would he have killed her, right? I stared at my sister, studying her face carefully. Even after all this time, I still knew when she was lying. He could have done it lots of ways, I said sharply. How'd you know that? She held my gaze, and for a second I considered giving up. But something in her seemed to deflate and she came clean. Luca spoke quietly, barely audible over the whir of the fan. They found her body. The shock made me nearly drop my bottle. No. When? A few years ago. No, that can't be possible. Why didn't the police release that? They didn't want to tip their hand. They were hoping to catch the killer coming back to the dump site. Disbelief had seized my lungs, making it impossible to speak. I'd spent years agonizing over what happened to my sister, and Luca had known the whole time. I didn't want to make you upset, she said quickly. I promise it was for your own good. Oh, spare me the big sister BS. You lost that right when you decided to keep this from me. I turned away from her, instead, staring out the window into the night sky. She walked toward the door and sighed. I've got the late shift tonight. I'll be back in a few hours. Julie's file is in the drawer in my room if you want to read it. I'm sorry. I continued to stare out the window and she walked out, her footsteps fading in the distance. I knew I'd been harsh, but my blood was still hot with indignation. After I heard the door open and shut, I went and got the file she mentioned, a manila folder with a few simple documents inside. What else had she kept from me? I scanned the pages, hungrily, not really knowing what I was looking for. I was going to give up when I spotted something in the coroner's report that made my heart drop. Extracted teeth. I read on, dread creeping through my body like an infection. Whoever killed Julie hadn't been content on just taking her life. He'd taken parts of her body as well. Her teeth, her ears, and her eyes. I thought back to that first tooth. It had been small. Childlike. In an instant, I had no doubt in my mind that whoever had done this to my sister was the same one tormenting me now. I heard the door open and shut again, the sound of Luca returning. Listen, I called. I read the file and I think what's been going on with my apartment is tied to what happened to Julie. We might not be safe here. She refused to respond and I felt a stab of guilt. No matter how awful it had been of her to keep that secret from me, she was all I had left, and the thought of losing another sister terrified me far more than any stalker. I'm sorry, I called, getting up to meet her in the living room. I didn't mean for it to come out like that, honest. I turned the corner into the hallway and froze in my tracks. The tall, disheveled man standing at the door was not Luca. Almost as frightening as the glistening knife in his hand, was the vacant look in his eyes. I would have expected rage or mania, but instead, there was just an animalistic coldness, a sort of icy determination. He was framed by a black rectangle, the door swung wide open behind him. Well, don't just leave the door open, I thought for one insane moment. You'll let out the AC. Then he took a step near me in his heavy work boots and I broke from my trance. I spun on my heels and made a break for the door, nearly tripping on my own feet. The man's steps thundered behind me, getting closer. I searched wildly for an escape. I had mistakenly run deeper into the house rather than toward the back door. I'd hit a dead end any second. Finally, I spotted a bathroom. I dashed inside and swung the door shut. The lock clicked just as the man slammed into the door like a freight train. I sank to my knees as a barrage of slams and bangs began raining down on the door. However, it was heavy oak and held fast. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking like a leaf, and began calling 911. The smell of gunpowder. A ringing in my ears. The door was suddenly wide open, a gaping chasm where the doorknob used to be. The man stood before me, a pistol in hand. I blinked as my mind finally registered what had happened. He'd shot off the doorknob. I'd just lost. I watched as he holstered the pistol and unslung something from his back. In my terror, I hadn't noticed the satchel he'd been carrying. He began rummaging through the bag with a sort of grim determination, a carpenter looking for the right tool. The metaphor wasn't too far off from the looks of what was inside. I felt the color drain from my face as I watched him sift through various kitchen knives and scalpels and pliers. Terrible possibilities flashed before me, like a magician's deck of playing cards. What was he planning to do? However, He eventually settled on a small wooden box, like what you'd keep jewelry in. He held it out to me, almost delicately. I looked into his eyes and I caught a glimpse of something. Was it remorse? Then he finally spoke. Although I was grateful for him breaking the nerve-wracking silence, the jumbled mess of ideas that poured from his mouth did little to shed light on what was happening. I just stared at him, trying to make sense of the incoherent mess of nouns and verbs. However, after a while, I began noticing some repeats. Words like sorry and forgive were very common. I also noticed phrases like I saw wrong and wrong one. Seemingly noticing my confusion, he paused. He took a deep breath and simply said the word, atonement, and handed me the box. I wanted to slap the box away. I wanted to throw it in the deepest darkest pit in the world and run as far from it as possible. But I knew the best way to not end up with a knife in the gut was to do what he said. I picked up the box and reluctantly opened it. Inside were 2 white lumps the size and texture of rotten eggs. I might even have been able to pretend they were if it weren't for the dark black pupils that dotted each of their centers. The man looked at me expectantly and I slowly stretched my face into what I desperately hoped passed for as a pleased smile. Childlike satisfaction colored the man's face, like a toddler getting a gold star. He put his knife back in the bag, zipped it, and stood up. I was feeling my heart rate slow when the man turned around slowly. "I'll be better from now on," he said. "I'll do better." And then he disappeared into the hallway, the stomps of his work boots fading into the quiet house. I felt something wet on my face. A look in the mirror revealed tears streaming down my face. What just happened? I noticed I was still holding that awful box. The box of what was left of my sister. Did he think this would make me feel better? In some twisted way, he thought he'd been doing a good thing, making things right. This explanation helped a bit, but there was still a dull twinge at the back of my mind. There was more to it than that, right? I saw wrong. Wrong one. I'll do better. Then I realized something that shattered my entire world. Luca and Julie were twins. He hadn't been sorry for killing my sister. He was sorry for killing the wrong sister. I stumbled to my feet on shaky legs and called Luca. It went straight to voicemail and I belted out a stream of curses. "Luca!" I screamed into the receiver. "Get in your car, go straight to the police station now. He's coming for you." "Sorry, I'm out of time, but I'll post the last half soon."